This lecture is on coordinated school health programs, which are also called or transitioned into something called the whole school, whole child, whole community model. All of your other lectures have had assignments attached to them, and this one does not. The reason it does not have an assignment attached to it is this material is covered in your final exam. While you're watching these slides and the presentation, you need to think about how this could relate to the grant program that you have developed. This is what the coordinated school health model looked like, and it had 8 components. As we look at how this is transitioned into the whole school, whole community, whole child model, you're going to see that these 8 elements have been expanded to include a few other elements, and some of them have been separated into different aspects. So these are the 8 components that were in the coordinated school health model. And the model was established to make sure that we were meeting all of the needs of students and not just 1 or 2 components. This now has transitioned into something called whole school, whole child, whole community. And beyond just health educators using this model, organizations like the National Education Association have also begun to use this model because it has become very evident to people involved in education that if a student is healthy, then he or she is much more likely to be successful in school. And so the focus on health education and how to get students to be healthy has been critical as we move forward. The first element in this model is health education, and there's certain issues about health education that are critical. Health education is supposed to be a sequential and organized program that exists in kindergarten or pre-K all the way through 12th grade. It requires planning so that it's not just a bunch of assemblies or a lesson here or there related to something that someone thinks is important. And because of that, the federal government has developed national standards for health education. And those national standards actually dictate what should be taught, and it also gives guidelines on what is age appropriate. For example, what you teach in family life in 3rd grade is very different than 5th or 6th grade, or what you would teach in high school. And so that's very critical, that the national standards help us develop not only what should be taught, but give us guidelines on when it should be taught. The other critical issue from the national standards and what health education should be is that health education should focus on prevention and promotion. It should not only be based on treatment after the fact of someone being sick. As you're thinking about your grant programs, how much of your programs are based on prevention and promotion, and how much is based on after-the-fact illness. And finally is relevancy. And this means that topics in health education have to be relevant to the student, to the community, and to the current times. For example, when you have safety education, the safety education standards are written in a way that people can alter them to meet the needs of their standards. Someone who's living on the Chesapeake Bay may have more information on boat and water safety, whereas someone who lives near railroad tracks might have information on railroad safety. Another example of relevancy is the fact that opioid addiction is a critical issue in the U.S. This means the standards have to be written in a way that topics can move in and out of the standards as needed, and that's how the standards are written. So as opioid addiction becomes a critical issue, it can be implanted into the K-12 curriculum with more focus on it, or it can be set up in a way where there's less focus on it. So these are the critical elements of health education. Some of you are actually looking at health education in school settings in your grants. It's interesting for you to see if your health education programs in the schools are K-12, if they're focused on prevention and promotion, and if they're focused on relevant issues to the student. If your grant does not ask you to do this, it is still something you might want to look into to see if the school system could help you in any way with your program. The next element is physical education and physical activity. What's critical about this issue is everyone knows that obesity has become an issue in the United States, and the concept of physical education and physical activity helps us teach students how activity can become part of their life. Just like health education, physical education and physical activity should be planned and sequential. It should not occur sporadically, but it should be based on what is planned for each year, and it should occur pre-K through 12, just like health education does. Physical education and physical activity, the courses that would go there, if they are done correctly, have two critical components. One is to teach students lifelong physical activity, and that's where you might see things like volleyball, softball, kickball, badminton. Those are the kind of things that people will be able to do in a lifetime. And it's important to teach students that because we want to encourage them to have lifelong physical activity. The other main element that happens in physical education classes is the focus on sports skills and how they relate to team sports or individual sports. So not only are physical educators focusing on lifelong physical activity, but they also are working on things like movement and sports skills, team sports, and the kind of sports that students play in school and possibly in which they get scholarships. And these include those kind of topics like gymnastics, football, baseball, lacrosse, soccer. These are the kind of sports that students play in teams and may or may not be part of a lifelong physical activity plan. And finally, physical activity and physical education should help enhance social and emotional wellness. And that means there needs to be thought into how teams are formed. In the old days, students would be selected as team captains and they would then select their teams, and the same children would be left to last every time, and that does not enhance social and emotional wellness. So another aspect that should occur when education in the physical arena is done correctly is that what happens in that class or that physical education class should always enhance the social and emotional wellness of the students. Next item in this model is nutrition services and education, and this also is highly related to the obesity issue in this country. And obesity is also related to several chronic diseases that are leading causes of death. So the nutrition services and education focus on these elements. The first one is that nutritious food is affordable and appealing. And this is where we have free and reduced lunch come into play. The federal government lays out guidelines of how much of each meal has to be carbohydrates, protein, or fat. It dictates how many fruits and vegetables have to occur in each meal. So those things are dictated by the federal government, and so school systems that receive federal funding for lunches have to work within those guidelines to try to create nutritious, affordable, and appealing food. One of the major issues that nutrition services face in a school system is trying to create food that meets all three standards. So oftentimes a food might be seen as nutritious, but it's not appealing to the students. So creating lunches full of nutritious food that the students are not going to eat is not an effective strategy. So this is a balancing act where we have to try to find nutritious food that students are going to eat. And that's one of the key issues that people consistently talk about in nutrition services and education. Nutrition education should also occur in the classroom, and it is a component of the health education K through 12 program. There needs to be an environment that promotes healthy habits, and if a school system gets financial aid for lunches and breakfasts, then what happens is that they're not allowed to have junk food or soda machines within a certain distance from the school from the cafeteria. A lot of schools have turned off their snack machines during the day, and they're only open for after-school programs or events. So by putting healthier choices into the machines, that's an example of how to promote healthy habits. Often people worry that if the healthy choices are in the machine, students won't choose them. But in reality, if you put water and juice into a soda machine with soda, oftentimes the water and this juice are sold out before the soda is. So students do choose healthier options when the choices are available. Another example about environment that promotes healthy habits, and it relates to nutritious and appealing food, is the implementation of breakfast programs in schools. I don't know how it was when you went to school. When I went to school, there was no breakfast program. That's how long ago I went to school. But then it transitioned to breakfast programs, but breakfast was always eaten in the cafeteria. And what was discovered recently is if children are allowed to take their breakfast in their homeroom, then they are much more likely to eat breakfast. So many schools are transitioning into a place where breakfast is delivered to the rooms of homeroom teachers, and students pick up their food there and eat it. And the next item for nutrition services and education is that it always has to focus on a way to focus on health for potential for the lifetime. So it shouldn't just be let's do stuff now, but we should be teaching students healthy habits, healthy foods to eat, and why it's important so that they can incorporate those items into their lifetime. So if you have a grant that's related to diseases, chronic diseases, obesity, a lot of these elements could relate to what you're doing in your programs. And you need to think about how you could either use these elements in your program or how these elements would relate to your program outside of schools or inside of schools. The next item is health services. In a good health coordinated program where everything is available, there are school nurses in the school settings. In Maryland, schools have school nurses in them. Not every state in the United States hires school nurses to be in the schools. School nurses are critical because they're trained to take care of physical ailments, diseases, and they can also offer preventative services like well visits and vaccines. And that relates to the bottom item, so I'm going to talk about those together. Many school systems have started to incorporate wellness clinics in their schools. Many of you talk about health services in your programs and your grants, and one of the reasons people do not utilize healthcare services is because they're inconvenient. By having school nurses who are trained to do this, preventative services like vaccinations can occur right on school site. Sports evaluations or exams could occur on school sites. Parents could bring children into schools that are not in school yet. So they might have a 3-year-old who needs a well doctor visit, and a nurse practitioner could do that. So these are all critical issues. One of the things you hear talk about with wellness clinics most often is the delivery of contraceptives. And that is possible in secondary schools, but it is not the only piece of a school health clinic. They also do emergency care and referral, and a lot of times we don't understand what poor people have to deal with. So when I was an assistant principal, I worked in a community that was a Title I school, which means more than half of the children are living in poverty. That means a lot of those parents did not have health insurance for their children, or they were not aware of how to utilize the health insurance. An example of how critical this is in health services is on a Monday, we had a student come into school that needed to see the nurse right away. And when the nurse saw the student, the nurse identified that the student's arm was broken. In researching that injury happened on a Friday evening, but the parents waited until Monday for the child to see the school nurse. The parents did not want to take the child to a doctor or an emergency room and pay that extra money unless it was necessary. So while many of us have health care providers and we see physicians or nurse practitioners routinely, there's a large percentage of the population in the United States who do not have health insurance and often rely on the school system to help them with emergency care and referrals. Other examples are doing, for example, vision tests and hearing tests and referring students to medical professionals as needed. Another item that health services addresses is chronic and acute conditions. Because more children go to schools and they're not in special schools for special needs children, the need for health services and school nurses becomes more critical. You could have someone with severe disabilities. You could have people who have severe asthma. You could have people who have latex allergies, or you actually have students who are on special equipment to help them. Some of that equipment might be a diabetic insulin pump, or it could be some type of respiratory equipment. Because the children in schools have more critical and more difficult issues surrounding them in their health, school nurses play a critical role in helping parents regulate conditions and diseases, helping them refer students out, and giving out medication every day in a school setting. The amount of medication that's given in a school is amazing. And until you see that happen, I think it's very difficult for people to understand how much a school nurse actually does. So in all of your programs, you might think about, can you utilize any of these types of services, whether it's inside a school or outside a school? The next component of this model is counseling, psychological, and social services. And this has to do with making sure that we promote a healthy development of children. We want to look at their cognitive, emotional, behavioral, and social needs. We want to help prevent and address problems as they occur, and we want to facilitate positive learning environments. The type of people who are involved in these settings are school counselors, school psychologists, or school social workers. And all of those people play a critical role in promoting healthy environments. When you're in a school system, children often come to school with many issues. It might be child abuse, it might be neglect, a parent could be addicted to drugs, and these are the people in a school setting who can help that child get the services that he or she needs. Beyond providing those services, we also have to make sure that we have created an emotional and social climate that is conducive to positive development. One item is being positive and safe, and that means that there's emotional support, acceptance, and nurturing of children. That we are there to support their needs, accept them for who they are, and nurture them in their development. There's social safety, such as peer issues and bullying. So schools have to be sure that they have established rules that are against bullying or peer issues that actually hurt development of students. Another example of social climate issues are community issues that come into the school. Often the problems that occur in school are actually overflow from items that are happening in the community. One way that schools have dealt with that has been to implement DARE officers in the schools, and the DARE officers, beyond teaching about drugs, also work with students to develop positive relationships with them so that they can help address and prevent community issues in the community that they are serving. The other item that's critical to emotional and social climate is that we know that if there's a positive emotional and social climate, it makes the school setting conducive to learning. Some ways that this is done is through teams of teachers. A lot of high schools are switching to this model, and it's established after the model that's used in many middle schools. And that is, there's a team of teachers that teach 100 to 150 students. And those teams of teachers have scheduled times to meet to talk about the students. They have scheduled times where they can meet together and meet with parents. And in those meetings, often there are the psychologist, social worker, or the school counselor, and often the assistant principal or an administrator is involved in those meetings. And that way, in those meetings, if a child is discussed, their progress in many classes can be addressed. Teachers and administrators and counselors can share their observations, and as a unit, they can create a plan for a child that helps them have a more positive social or emotional climate in the school. The other way this is addressed is by having smaller groupings of students. So again, high schools, a lot of them are beginning to transition to this model, and rather than just having a high school of 2,500 or 3,000 students, they're breaking them into mods or groupings. And so there might be an environmental science mod group of students, and there might be a literary group of students, and those groups of students then stay in one part of the school for most of their day, and that allows the smaller groupings. It's conducive to learning, and it's also conducive to creating this emotional and social climate. It is much easier to deal with 150 students with a team of teachers than it is to deal with 3,000 students in the overall school. Also related to this smaller grouping or teams approach is often a guidance counselor and an administrator will follow their students throughout. So for example, as an assistant principal, when the 6th graders came in, if I was their 6th grade administrator, I followed them to 7th and 8th grade. And whoever their counselor was also followed them through 7th and 8th grade. So that allowed some consistency for the parents and the students as students transition through some critical years. Most schools allow or encourage or require administrators and counselors to transition with their students each year. Often in middle schools, not so much in high schools, but in middle schools and elementary schools, they encourage some transition of teachers. So while there's a team of teachers in 6th grade, there might be a transition of one of those teachers to 7th grade and then to 8th grade. So there might be one teacher who follows an entire group of students throughout their time in a school setting. Next is physical environment, and these are some examples of physical environment issues. The first is lead or asbestos or mold or mildew, and there's usually one administrator in the building that is responsible for the physical environment of the building. Also related to this, that would be recently added in the last 10 or so years, is the building safe? Are there safety places in the building? Is it difficult for outsiders to enter the building? Is there an intercom system, cameras, or all the doors locked? Because that helps create a safe environment. Another issue is the school handicap accessible? If there's a student or a teacher who has a handicapping condition, can they get to all the areas of the school, and can they participate in all the activities that occur in the school? And closely related to that is the acceptance of all students, no matter their size or shape or background. And so one of the issues that often comes up in universities is the use of the desks and chair combined. Those desk-chair combinations are not accepting of all sizes and shapes. It's rare that there's the right number of left-handed desks in a classroom. There's either too many or too few. Anybody who's larger in size cannot fit into those desks and comfortably. So as you look at school settings, K through 12, almost no schools have those desks anymore. They almost all have tables and chairs. And that's because those are more accepting of different sizes and shapes, and you don't have to worry about whether it's left-handed or right-handed or things like that. The next one is having an employee wellness program or having a health promotion program for staff, and this is called worksite wellness. In a worksite wellness program, people are promoting an environment that promotes healthy living. So people are encouraged to have walking clubs at their school. They might have exercise programs at their school, and these are for staff, faculty. There's also usually assessment programs, like they might come in and do fat assessment. They might come in and do BMI. They might come in and do a fitness assessment for the faculty and staff. But there's there's a focus on health and well-being of the school staff. And this saves a lot of money for school systems in regards to healthcare costs. But another element of this is if the school staff practice healthy behaviors, they serve as role models for students. So, for example, if students see teachers walking every day during their planning periods, or they know that there's a fitness class after school for their teachers, they then understand that the staff at the school also is concerned about wellness, and they then serve as role models. The next one is family engagement, and what's critical in family engagement in health and safety of students is the school and the family should be working together for the child. Oftentimes, schools get into a situation where it's us versus them, the school versus the family, and that really should never be the case. There should always be a striving to work as a team. So if the family and school support health education and they work as a team to address all of these issues for the children, it's a much better situation for the children. They're much more likely to be successful. There's also a lot of research that shows if parents or caregivers are involved in the school in any way, their children typically do better in school. A lot of those studies have been done in areas of poverty and whether or not fathers are involved in the school setting. And when fathers are involved in their children's schooling, the children do better. And that has also been expanded to any family or caregiver. The more family engagement that occurs, the better the children typically do in school. Community involvement is creating partnerships and supporting services in your community that help you work on all of these issues. So, for example, a school where I worked, we had a partnership with a doctor who came in and did sports exams every year for free. We also had some partnerships in the community where businesses served as mentors, and we paired up our children with mentors from the business community, and they would spend 1 or 2 days a month with their mentor. So, for example, the mentor might come in at lunchtime and eat lunch with the student, or they might have a time set up after school. And sometimes there were also trips or activities that were organized for the mentors and their students to do together, like bowling or something like that. So those types of partnerships support what the school's trying to do in creating healthy students. And so that's another way the community involvement occurs. So those are the elements of the whole school, whole child, whole community model. This is what the model looks like. It's designed to focus on the student and having the student be supported, successful, and engaged and healthy. So as you're working through everything and preparing for your final exam, you need to examine these different elements to determine what could work in helping you improve your program. It's not expected at this point that you would add it to your program, but as you reflect back on your grant and your program and you hear about these elements, which of these would really have made your program better? So that concludes the lecture on whole school, whole community, whole child. Again, there's no assignment that goes with this because you will be seeing this material on your final exam.